As I have studied denominations and watched videos or read articles from ministers in these denominations, and also videos and articles from those who oppose them, I've found that it's pretty easy to misunderstand or misrepresent someone, especially when you're preaching to the choir and there's nobody from the other side to fact check you. One passion that I have always had is that of fairly representing the position of someone I disagree with. Take the scenario of teaching a Sunday school class. Maybe you're a Calvinist and you're taking on Arminianism. Let's simplify it and pretend there's just two options. Option one is misrepresent Arminianism, really make a straw man out of their position. This seems tempting at first because you can easily crush the straw man, make out those Arminians as people who just can't understand the Bible and miss the most basic things, and boy, nobody in that class will ever become an Arminian after they saw you take out the trash. The second option is that you don't misrepresent Arminians. Instead, you actually bring up their own arguments. You maybe fairly present an Arminian argument against Calvinism and discuss it. Now, this can seem dangerous because what if you accidentally raise questions in the minds of your Calvinist listeners? What if they actually view the Arminian argument as convincing? But now, having brought up their real position, you can seek to address it. Now, this can go for any theological issue with two sides, but let's think of the actual results. Imagine a person who heard the first lesson, the one that really misrepresented Arminianism and destroyed it and made its adherents look like fools. Someone in your class may run into an Arminian the following week. They'll think that they're all prepared to take on the challenge. They have it figured out, and so they present the same earth-shattering arguments to the Arminian. And the Arminian says, "Hold on a second, that's not actually what I believe." Then, the Arminian shows this person clearly how that you misrepresented Arminianism, and then the Arminian brings up the strong argument. The Arminian is the one who gets to share this argument, one you never raised and never rebutted. Certainly, now the person who sat in your class is in a position where Arminianism seems far more reasonable than it did when they heard you speak about it. By avoiding fairly representing someone and not addressing their strongest arguments, you actually leave a person more vulnerable to those arguments down the line. This goes for any set of theology. For example, I've seen many comments on my channel of people who have converted to Catholicism who proclaim that they were part of a denomination that was strongly opposed to the church. However, one of the things that ended up bringing them to the Catholic Church was when they realized that much of what they had been told was a misrepresentation. Now, in this video, my goal is not to say that any one group's set of teachings are more believable than you've been told, or to say that Arminians need to reconsider Calvinism or Calvinists need to reconsider Arminianism. Rather, I'm going to point out a few beliefs that people hold to that you may be unintentionally strawmanning, and more precisely, areas where two or more denominations may use the same term and have a doctrine they teach that is called by one title, but these denominations don't actually believe the same thing. I'm going to assume that you want to represent other people fairly, even if you disagree with them. So let's look at some confusing areas where you might be unintentionally misrepresenting others. And since I began my illustration with Arminianism, let's start the discussion here. There are actually many different things a person may believe about soteriology, that is, the doctrines surrounding salvation, and be classified as an Arminian. I'm not going to delve into that. There are actually whole channels that do nothing but argue these types of distinctions, but let me at least point out one spectrum of belief that contains many camps that you shouldn't get confused. I'm particularly going to discuss the question of, is it possible for a person who is in a saved condition today to somehow end up in an unsaved condition and end up going to hell? Now, the Arminian answer to this question is yes. They would deny the idea of once saved, always saved. But there are at least two camps. I mean, there are definitely more than that, but there are these two. The one camp says that a person once saved cannot forfeit salvation due to unrepentant sin. That is, a person who is truly saved may sin, may grieve the Holy Spirit, but so long as they are trusting in Jesus Christ and His shed blood for salvation, they're still saved. The person in this camp of Arminians would, however, say that a person could decide to apostatize. A truly saved individual still has free will, and that free will means that they could decide at some point to no longer believe in Jesus at all. They can reject the faith, and they can willingly abandon their salvation. A very opposite camp we can imagine, though this camp is basically a straw man, says that whenever a Christian sins, he loses his salvation. Very, very few people believe this. Between these positions, though, are many others. One might be that a Christian who lives in willing and unrepentant sin is at risk of giving up his salvation. There's more nuances here. Many Arminians dislike people representing them as saying that you can lose your salvation, like one day you were just living your life saved and then, oops, I lost it. That's maybe even further toward a straw man than the one I already mentioned. So for any denomination, church, or preacher that is Arminian, if you want to accurately represent them, find out what they actually believe on this. Can a person once saved become unsaved due to sin, or is full-blown apostasy necessary? As I said, there are many positions on the spectrum. Here's another one, decision theology. Now, most people who believe in quote-unquote decision theology don't use that term. I'm talking about people who teach a necessary born-again experience or believe that a person needs to get saved at a moment of time. Someone who asks you what date you believed in Christ and got saved, and they aren't asking about the date of your infant baptism. Reality is that there are many views on the spectrum here too, and if you want to represent people fairly, you need to distinguish them. Here's a few things to consider when discussing what a denomination may or may not believe about decision theology. First, they may or may not believe in a necessary sinner's prayer. You know, that prayer of salvation that televangelists have you pray at the end, or that people in evangelical movies pray when they've reached the end of their rope. While many churches do encourage a person praying such a prayer and would identify that prayer with a person's salvation decision, there are others that don't require or even discourage such a prayer. In most cases, what both those who do and do not use the prayer method actually believe is that a person receives salvation in the moment that they truly put their faith in Jesus Christ and his death for their sins and resurrection. Some people view a prayer that verbally states these facts as either necessary or useful, and others view it as unnecessary or even confusing or undesirable. In the same way, some people count any person who prayed the sinner's prayer as a new Christian, while others emphasize more strongly that getting someone to say something doesn't mean they actually believe it, so they are resistant to do anything that might pressure someone into simply repeating an insincere prayer. Perhaps they use the sinner's prayer, but they would never ask a congregation to repeat it. Only after Bible studies and a potential convert expressing a desire to be saved would they have them pray. It should also be mentioned that many who teach a necessary moment of saving faith for salvation don't believe that it is necessarily any kind of fancy experience. Though others do, many do not believe that there are any warm fuzzies or that a person will necessarily feel anything different in that moment. Though most would emphasize that this is a very important moment that begins a changed life, they believe it's an interior change, a heart change, and that doesn't necessarily lend itself to physical manifestations. There's also some who are more cautious about making sure a person truly understands the gospel before trying to lead them in any way toward this salvation experience. For example, not having Sunday school teachers of young children attempt to get them saved, but rather to teach them and wait for them to recognize their own need for salvation. And others dislike this approach. And there's even those who believe in decision theology, so-called, but may believe that a person may not know exactly when they believed. They just became convinced over time or grew up in a household that taught the truth and don't remember exactly when that faith became their own. Some dislike this view quite a bit, but it's still present within many denominations that are labeled with the decision theology tag. Now that we've discussed the decision theology crowd, let's look to those in one opposing position, which is those denominations which would be fine to say, baptism saves. You know, these are the people who might put up 1 Peter 3:21, the like figure whereunto even baptism doth also now save us, on the church sign without following it up with a 2-minute explanation. Just because someone is willing to say baptism saves doesn't mean they all believe the same things about it. For example, there's those who might explain it this way. Jesus died on the cross to bring us salvation. His blood is sufficient to cleanse us from all sin. However, not all the world is saved by his blood. Those who believe in him receive salvation, and that salvation is given at the moment of baptism. Not that the baptism is absolutely required. God could save without it, say if a person couldn't be baptized due to a physical issue, or like in the case of the thief on the cross, but the normative time that a person receives salvation is in baptism. These people would say that in that sense, then, baptism saved. But it's not that the water is special or can wash sin away because it only works because of Christ's shed blood. And it's not that faith is unnecessary. Contrast this view to other views. Some would say, and they may view this as contradicting the other position, or maybe not, that the moment of baptism is at the time salvation normally occurs, but that salvation is received by faith. So it's the faith that saves, but at the time of baptism. Others say that baptism only saves if the person has previously believed, and so they would not recognize infant baptism, while yet others say that the faith necessary for baptism can be exercised by the parents and later confirmed in the child in the sacrament of confirmation. And yet others may say God actually works the faith in the infant child, and there's mixtures of these beliefs too. Here's the point. Whether or not you believe baptism saves, it's inaccurate to say that everyone who believes that baptism saves believes that water can wash away sin, and certainly wrong to say they think that it could do so without the shed blood of Christ. It's inaccurate to say that their positions don't take into account that some people have been saved without baptism, because their positions do address that. And I'll throw it in there that not everyone who says baptism saves would accept their viewpoint as being called baptismal regeneration. Some do, but to use that term for others would be misrepresentation. The fourth group I'd like to mention is that of charismatics and Pentecostals. Now first, people often confuse these two with each other. That's one mistake you shouldn't be making, and to learn how to avoid that, watch my video that compares and contrasts these two groups. However, there is a major area in which these two groups agree. They both confess the ongoing nature of all of the spiritual gifts, including things like modern-day healing, prophecy, and speaking in tongues. But within Pentecostal and charismatic churches, there is wide variety in the use and restriction on use of these gifts. I have witnessed criticism of Pentecostalism with the claim that Pentecostals all violate biblical regulation on the use of tongues, allowing people to speak more than one at a time, allowing people to do so without interpretation, and so forth. This just isn't accurate. There are, of course, Pentecostals and charismatics that fit all across the spectrum. Some have no limits on the use of the gifts in worship. Others teach that certain uses of the gifts are not appropriate, and some actually have very little use of the gifts in worship. Now, I'm not going to bat for any of these. I'm not saying that one or the other is wrong, but I am saying that if you claim that all Pentecostals have people speaking in tongues all at once, or that all of them practice being slain in the Spirit and so on, you're incorrect. I'm in favor of polemics. Feel free to argue whatever point you want to make, but while you're doing so, be honest. Don't put everyone in the same basket. I'm sure that's the way that you would hope others would represent you. One thing I've also seen that relates to this subject is that people often base their opinions about a whole denomination based on their limited experiences. Perhaps they experienced overbearing leadership in one Reformed congregation, and now the whole denomination is branded as being dictators. Perhaps they experienced a cold Anglican church, and now they think that all Anglicans are unfriendly. Realize that, statistically speaking, if you rank the congregations in every denomination from worst to best, there's 10% that are in the 90th percentile of the worst churches, and maybe you just happened to visit a church in that group. Of course, maybe you didn't. Maybe you visited the best church. The point is, don't assume. Find out, ask around, and don't broad brush everyone based on your limited experience. This is even worse, I think, if you go beyond denominations with your claims. You know of something you disagree with at Southern Baptist churches, and so you say all Baptist churches are bad based on that, or take it even further and see people who broad brush all Christians as being the same. Christians are all to X, Y, or Z, but you're talking about over 2 billion people. Isn't that a bit of an overgeneralization? A tried and true practice to avoid these pitfalls is before you debate or make a case against someone's theology, see if you can describe what they believe in a way they agree with. If you can't do this, then the whole exercise will probably go nowhere. But if you can, then instead of running in circles and playing straw man whack-a-mole, you can dig into these important topics and maybe, just maybe, have a valuable discussion.